Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Let's not be snarky. At some point, the endless peace talks between Ukraine and her allies and Russia and the United States may result in the end of this murderous 4-year war. But that day isn't today. Russia is still advancing on the ground and still randomly killing civilians in their apartment blocks with its missiles and drones. In Washington, President Trump sounds much friendlier to Vladimir Putin than he does to President Zelenskyy, who was in London today. And for why? Well, really, so that the leaders of Britain, France and Germany could put their arms around him. Both Trump and Putin want Zelenskyy to give up big chunks of his country. Keir Starmer and the other Europeans were, they said, standing with him. Although quite what that means for the horrible dilemma Zelenskyy now faces is unclear. The bigger picture still is that we in Europe no longer have the Americans with us. They are talking about the civilizational erasure of European identity by mass immigration and censorship. And Moscow agrees with Washington. That Atlantic bond celebrated by Winston Churchill and which kept us relatively safe throughout the second half of the 20th century has gone. Or at least it's going. So that means our world is even more dangerous than we thought it was. We're going to need not just the weapons, but the leadership to carry us through by ourselves. I wish I thought that the London summit today showed leaders who, going beyond the immediate Ukraine dilemma, understood the scale of the change that is coming. But I don't. Let's hear first tonight from Dame Emily Thornberry, Chair of the Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Emily, thank you very much for joining me. When you saw that American document talking about the erasure of European civilization because of immigration, did you feel that was quite a moment in terms of the Americans' attitude to us?
No, because I listened to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich in February, and it's pretty much all the same stuff. Do you remember then? He said that the greatest threat from the continent was not, to America was not from Russia but from within. I mean, it's like wow, yeah. So I think I suspect it's a J.D. Vance document, isn't it? It's certainly very consistent with what he's been saying.
It's a general turning of the back, isn't it, from Washington on Europe, and therefore seems to me to be a really serious moment. And I just wonder where it leads us.
Well, what I found interesting is that Donald Trump hasn't said anything about it yet. Actually, I think that there are lots of different groups within MAGA, and what I learned when I went to Washington earlier this year was that unless Donald Trump said it, people didn't agree with it. So people might kind of fly kites here and there, but you need to hear Donald Trump saying this.
Well, gosh, I hope you're right.
I'm not. Listen. I mean, I'm not saying that he doesn't, but I don't think he necessarily. I think that he has an affection, at least for some parts of Europe, which are clearly stronger than J.D. Vance's. Although, J.D. Vance wants to come here on holiday. I mean, you'd think that, travel is supposed to broaden the mind. It doesn't seem to in his case.
Let me ask you about what may or may not be going on between President Zelenskyy and the other European leaders, because it was clearly an act of solidarity to have him in Downing Street. Lots of hugs and handshakes outside. But if the issue is now about how much land he's prepared to give to Russia, it seems a very unlikely moment to talk about a breakthrough. He has been absolutely steely so far. Do you think the Ukrainians are being pushed into a corner where they accept they are going to have to hand land to Russia?
Again, I think there's a difference between handing land to Russia and having frozen borders. So you don't actually recognize that this part of Ukraine has been taken by Russia or is now Russia, but that the borders are simply frozen. And I think that if that had been what was on the table, then we might have been getting closer to peace than we are at the moment. The difficulty is that the Russians don't just want the bits that they've got so far, but they also want things that they've been fighting over now for 3 years and haven't been able to get, the rest of the Donbass, which is or certainly was one of the richer areas of Ukraine. So, they can't win it in a war, but they want to be able to win it.
Handed it, as it were.
Yeah. Handed it by Donald Trump. And I think what needs to happen is that actually Europe needs to show more confidence in itself. It needs to flex its muscles and needs to make it clear that Ukraine's security is actually Europe's security too, which is why we have been so involved and consistently involved in the war in Ukraine in terms of supporting Ukraine. And it really is about time that we finally spent the frozen Russian assets, which is about 200 billion, isn't it, of euros throughout Europe. I think we've got about £8 billion in the UK, and I think it's now hoped that there will be some breakthrough before Christmas, and finally we will be able to spend that money in Ukraine, being able to defend Ukraine, and that will make a big difference. But Europe has to. I mean, I'm really pleased that France and Germany and Britain are standing with him and making it clear this isn't just a photo opportunity. There is a lot of work going on behind the scenes. It just isn't the sort of thing that can be talked about publicly or necessarily bragged about. But I think without Europe standing with Ukraine, the whole thing might well have collapsed a lot earlier. Ukraine might have collapsed a lot earlier, and certainly under the pressure that at times, America puts on Ukraine, that Ukraine might have folded, but they haven't.
And if we have to go through a period now when America is giving either no or minimal support to Ukraine directly, how long do you think Europe is able to, as it were, fill that gap and provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to keep defending itself?
So it's a lot of it's about the money. So, I mean, I think that the 200 billion will keep the Ukrainians going for a while. And essentially, America's involvement at the moment is Europe buys weapons from the Americans and gives it to Ukraine. The only thing that I think that America is really doing independent is obviously the navigation system. So, in order to ensure that that targeting is done properly. That's the only thing, I think, at the moment. That's the only contribution. And actually, people keep talking about, Europe has to step up, Europe has to do more. Actually, Europe is carrying the burden of this. I mean, obviously, the Ukrainians are really carrying the burden. The Ukrainians are the ones who are dying. But in terms of support, it's Europe that is, and not the United States.
Emily, later in the show, I'm going to be talking about your leader, Keir Starmer, and his position in the party. Lots of your colleagues, as you know, are talking about some kind of move against him and his record as Prime Minister. But you've observed him as a foreign leader. Would you say that's the best of him, that he has done pretty well when it comes to Trump, when it comes to Ukraine?
I think that his contribution has been outstanding internationally. I think there is no doubt about it. I think we would be in a very different place on so many different issues if it wasn't for the leadership that Britain has shown. And it is in such contrast to where we were under the previous government, when people openly laughed at us. I mean, Britain is back on the international stage, and we are welcome. And there's never been a time when Britain hasn't been needed more. And for the Foreign Office and for our leadership to be as clear as it is. I mean, there are times when we make mistakes, but actually, on the whole, we are received really well. I've seen it, and people know what we're about, why we're doing it. And I mean, obviously, unlike other countries where there's a president who can go off to a lot of these summits and so on. Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister. He needs to be leading in the country at home, but as well as abroad. And it's very difficult given the amount that's going on.
It certainly is. I mean, he has been abroad an astonishing amount since he became Prime Minister. Do you think that's damaged him domestically, because his reputation domestically is not high?
I think it's very difficult for him to be able to, literally to be in two places at once. That's the problem, isn't it? The work that he's doing on the international stage is really important, and no one else can do it in the way that he's able to. Britain is in a unique position, and he has unique relationships with all sorts of people, obviously, including Donald Trump. And he uses that to the advantage of our country and to our allies. And that's recognised. Yeah. To do that, as well as keep an eye on, the details of domestic policy, is really challenging.
Not easy. Not easy.
It's not easy.
Emily Thornberry, thank you very, very much for talking to LBC tonight. Much appreciated. And now, somebody who has first-hand experience of just how brutal Putin's regime can be, Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian opposition politician and former political prisoner. He was sent to a prison colony in Siberia for speaking out against the Russian president, and he was released as part of a large prisoner exchange in 2024. You may remember that we talked at the time. Vladimir, it's great to have you back on the show. We're obviously trying to guess, as it were, whether the Kremlin, Putin in particular, is interested in any of these peace proposals going to him. We've had the first American one and then the second European one, and now we've got another one. Do you think all of this is a complete blind by Putin? He's got no interest?
Well, hello, Andrew, and it's always good to be back on your program. Well, this month actually marks 26 years since Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia. This man is not an enigma. There's nothing new that we need to learn about him. And for the whole of this time that he's been in power, now into his second quarter of a century, this man has continued to kill. He has killed people in our own country. He has murdered two of his most important political opponents, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. He has killed people outside of the country. He came to power on the back of a brutal second war in Chechnya. He then continued with the war in Georgia, with the first war in Ukraine starting in 2014, with the incursion in Syria on the side of the dictator Assad. Then, of course, the current ongoing full-scale invasion of Ukraine that has been going on since February of 2022, the largest land conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And by the way, those two things, the internal repression and the external aggression, always go hand in hand in Russia. A government that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people is not going to respect the borders of its neighbors. And so, no, the answer to his question is very simple. No, Vladimir Putin is not interested in peace, and this war will not end. There will not be security for Ukraine. There will not be security for Europe as a whole for as long as Vladimir Putin and his repressive regime remains in power.
Yes, because if, as you say, I hadn't really thought about it like this, but he has existed with war all the way through his presidency. There has always been war. Then the idea that he might stop in Ukraine, there'd be a peace deal, and then he'd go quiet, rather than, for instance, going after the Baltic states or parts of Poland or somewhere else, seems for the birds.
Look, the only tools that Vladimir Putin uses to keep himself and his regime in power are fear, repression, violence, and war. We do not have free elections in Russia. We do not have, the rule of law in Russia. We do not have independent media. We do not have a real parliament. We have nothing. In fact, I sort of have an objection to when you called in your introduction of me, you called Putin president. He's not president. He's a usurper.
Right.
We have a two-term limit in our constitution in Russia for president. He's been in power for 26 years. I'm sorry, no president in a normal country stays in power that long. So he is a usurper. He is a dictator. And most importantly, he is a murderer. And so, no, there will not be peace in Europe for as long as Putin remains in power. The only way we can achieve sustainable peace, security, and stability for Ukraine, and sustainable peace, stability, and security for the whole of the European continent, because Russia is the largest country in Europe, after all, is with a democratic Russia. Only when there's political change in Russia, only when we have a normal system of government, a government that is accountable to its own people and that respects and abides by the civilized norms of international behavior, only then will there be peace in Europe. The best we can hope for now is some kind of a temporary ceasefire. Your previous guest mentioned the word frozen. I think that's a very apt way to describe it, frozen, to freeze the conflict. And so to me, the most important thing, the single most important thing that can be achieved now with a possible temporary ceasefire is to make sure that all people who are held captive because of this war, meaning Ukrainian civilian hostages, abducted Ukrainian kids, and Russian political prisoners who are jailed, like I was until last year, for opposing and speaking out against this war, that all these people must be released as part of any agreement. And you may have seen, Andrew, last week, there was a public appeal from 17 Nobel Prize winners to the leaders of Europe, United States, Ukraine, and to Putin, calling for any deal over a ceasefire in Ukraine to include the release of all the captives of this war, Ukrainian civilian hostages and Russian political prisoners alike, because this is what can be done now, and human lives must be the priority in any kind of discussions.
Well, that is a really important point there, Vladimir. You were released, of course, under the presidency of Joe Biden. He was very much engaged in that prisoner release. What do you make of the way that Donald Trump is treating Putin, oiling up to him?
Well, I think it's very clear that Donald Trump really likes Vladimir Putin. It was clear enough in his first term. You may recall, the shameful meeting in Helsinki in the summer of 2018 between Trump and Putin, when the late Senator John McCain said that, nowhere, not at any moment in history has an American president so debased himself before a foreign dictator. These were his words. And this policy is even more pronounced in a second term. I mean, we see the current American president chastising and criticizing constantly the Ukrainian leadership, including just yesterday when, Trump said again that he's disappointed in Zelenskyy. Well, he never seems to be disappointed in Vladimir Putin.
Indeed.
And in fact, we've seen all these stories in the press recently, including how members of the Trump administration are actually advising Putin's staff, Putin's aides, Witkoff and Ushakov. You remember that phone conversation. They're actually advising Putin on how best to deal with Trump to get to his ends. And this so-called 28-point peace plan that was presented by the White House at the end of November over Ukraine, that's not a peace plan. This reads more like Vladimir Putin's Christmas wish list, because it essentially gives Putin everything he wanted, including territory he has not been able to capture militarily in 11 years, because let's not forget this war's been going on since 2014,
yes.
Including, which to me is the most shocking and unacceptable part of the so-called American peace plan, is a full amnesty for all the war crimes that Putin's army has been committing in Ukraine over these many years now. Because the one thing we will definitely need in Russia after the Putin regime is gone is full reckoning and full accountability for all the crimes that are being committed. This is just as important for Russia as it is for Ukraine, because our country is not going to have a normal and democratic future until all these scoundrels and criminals are held accountable for everything they've done.
Of course. Do you think Donald Trump is a Russian asset?
Well, we'll find that out once there's political change in Russia and the archives open and all the documents come to light. If that is true, we will find that out. Obviously, I have no privy knowledge or any inside information on this, but what I think is very clear, beyond any doubt, is that Donald Trump really likes Vladimir Putin. And he's very much like him. I think they share the same mentality, the same psychotype. I think Trump would love to rule in the same way that Putin rules in Russia, with no parliament, no judiciary, no independent media, no checks and balances. And so I think he has a genuine affinity for him. And this is a fact that now basically determines the fate of the world and global international affairs.
Well, there is a really unsettling thought to end on. Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you so much for talking to LBC and me tonight. Coming up, the government has announced millions of pounds of investment in more than 50,000 jobs in tech. Is this a step towards reducing the number of young people out of work on welfare? I'm going to be talking to a government minister next. By the time now, 6:19.
Weekdays from 7 a.m. Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:20. Let's turn more directly to domestic politics. One good and useful announcement from Keir Starmer today. He was setting out plans for a £750 million investment, which will mean more than 50,000 apprenticeships in engineering and AI and other sectors. Launching the scheme, he suggested he didn't think the average cabinet minister necessarily had the right tools to run their departments.
We need to crack this in politics, by the way, because around the cabinet table, we did a little survey a few weeks ago, and I think pretty well everyone around the cabinet table had been to university, but no one had been an apprentice. And so I think the challenge is more in politics and some of our other institutions. I think business actually has a good case to tell on apprenticeships going all the way to the top. I think it's the rest of us that need to do some catching up.
Well, I'm joined now by Dame Diana Johnson, the Employment Minister. Do you think the Prime Minister has a point there? He was effectively saying that ministers are not very good at running things. They don't have the hands-on skill to run the big departments they're in charge of, and they'd be better off if they'd done an apprenticeship of some kind.
Well, I think it's horses for courses, isn't it? I mean, there are reasons why you would go to university and do a degree, and I think that's very sensible in some cases. I'm thinking medicine and law, perhaps. But equally, apprenticeships can also provide a different route, and they've obviously been successful in some parts of the economy already, and we know lots of young people want to earn and learn at the same time. But the Prime Minister has said that he wants 2/3 of young people either to be going through university or high-quality apprenticeship. So I think it's a combination of both.
I'm very interested in the sort of difference between the two and the way they're seen, because Tony Blair famously wanted half of all school leavers to go to university. And there has been a sense that, very much unlike the Germans in this country, we have undervalued apprenticeships. Do you think that's true?
I think that probably is the case, actually. And I also think, I mean, today's announcement is around apprenticeships, but at the weekend we had the announcement around the Youth Guarantee, which is about setting all young people up to succeed and to be given the opportunities they need to get into work. So apprenticeships in some cases, going to university in other cases, but making sure young people have that training available to them.
Meanwhile, we've had the minimum wage, particularly for young people, going up, and we've had the national insurance contribution for employers going up. And there's a general sense in the economy that this has really put off a lot of firms from hiring, including, frankly, apprenticeships and people we're talking about just now. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think it's worth saying that for any employer who takes someone on under 21, they don't have to pay any national insurance contribution. So that's one thing. Employers often say they want to make sure they're getting good people into jobs, and that means that apprenticeships are going to be part of that, training up the young people for the jobs that employers have. And as to the minimum wage, I mean, that's set really on the recommendation of the Low Pay Commission, and you will recognise they're a very long established. They do, but it's a very long-established commission that's internationally recognised, and I think it's I don't think there's been one time when a government hasn't accepted the recommendation. Of course, the Low Pay Commission has business, trade unions on it to make decisions about what can be borne by the market.
It could well have been behind the kind of slowing down in employment in the economy at the moment and the rise in unemployment. We both mentioned AI earlier on. Do you inside government do any assessment of how many jobs and where are going to go because of AI within the next few years?
Oh, I'm sure that work is underway. I've been the Employment Minister just since September, so I'm certainly interested in what the repercussions of AI are. Of course, there may be some jobs that are lost to AI, but there will be other jobs that will be created because of AI. So I'm sure that work is underway, yes.
Presumably the government is going to have to know where the jobs are going to be lost. In other words, to ensure that you mop up some of the people who are suddenly unemployed because of AI, and there will be an awful lot of them.
Absolutely, and that obviously there is a lot of work going on analysing what is happening within AI. I also ought to say that the mayors, we have a lot of mayors now around the country, and they will certainly be looking at what's happening in their local labour markets, and will be looking at particularly at AI and what the repercussions for their local residents could be as well.
Quite a few of your colleagues in the government, particularly in Cabinet, are already talking about removing the Prime Minister and replacing him with somebody else. What's your view?
Look, Andrew, I've been in Parliament 20 years. I've been in opposition for 14 years. This is our big opportunity in government now to change this country. I want to get on with that. I want the Prime Minister to get on with being... Oh, bless you.
I do beg your pardon.
I want the Prime Minister to get on with that. And I really, frankly, have no time for this tittle-tattle about jockeying for positions. We've got to actually now deliver the change that people want in this country.
No tittle-tattle, no sneezing. Diana Johnson. Thank you very much indeed for that. So, as we've heard, it's not just getting a job that matters, but also holding on to it once you've got it. Deeply unpopular in the country, Keir Starmer now faces the problem of members of his own cabinet debating whether and when to ditch him. Now, that is a dangerous project. The markets, for instance, don't like the idea of a further period of turmoil, but Labour MPs are getting desperate. Meanwhile, here is one for the why would they do that box. Labour Together, the pro-Starmer think tank whose former boss Morgan McSweeney is now his chief of staff, has started surveying the party to find out which of 8 Labour ministers would make a better leader. Again, why would they do that? Very unhelpful. Let's find out more with Rob Ford, a member of Labour Together's advisory board and author of the British General Election of 2024, which is out soon. Rob, thank you very much for coming on to the show. First of all, I said that it was a pro-Starmer organisation, Labour Together. Is that fair or unfair?
Well, I mean, they've certainly worked a lot with Starmer and with people associated with Starmer in the past. It's a matter of public record that they were set up by Morgan McSweeney and a number of Starmer allies and did an awful lot of research that was helpful to Starmer's leadership campaign ahead of the 2020 Labour leadership contest. Research not dissimilar from what's being done here. Yeah. I should say, as an advisory board member, I wasn't invited to comment on this particular survey. That's what we do as academic advisory board people like me. We comment on research, but they didn't ask me about this one.
Sure, that is very good, because you're then free to comment on it when I say this is a completely bizarre thing to be doing for a Labour think tank to be actually semi-publicly canvassing opinion about who should replace the Prime Minister.
Well, if I may, Andrew, I'm going to do a very academic thing and argue either side of the case on this one for you. So on the one hand, I think there is a logical research-based case for this kind of thing, which is the Labour membership is like the membership of every party in a state of constant flux. We've been hearing, for example, a lot about Labour members going off and joining the Greens and so on and so forth. When they did the research, it was also Labour Together in 2020, they were quite surprised at how much change there had been in the membership. This isn't a constant group of people. And one of the ways you can get at what sort of people are in the Labour Party now and what they think about people is exactly this kind of survey. Now, the reporting is going very heavily on the leadership questions, but there are also lots of questions in there about the ideological orientation of members, about their views on the issues and stuff like this. So the case for it is you want to understand your membership. The case against it is it doesn't take a genius to work out that at a point like this, if you ask a question about potential successors to Starmer and people find out about that, it's going to be a bit of a story.
It certainly is. Deeply embarrassing, as I said at the beginning. I've been told that because of all sorts of issues, but including the success of the Greens, the nature of the average Labour Party member has changed quite a lot, and therefore people who assume the party will always go for the most left-wing candidate if and when there's a leadership contest may be wrong.
Well, quite so, Andrew, and you and I are probably both veteran enough to remember that was exactly the discussion ahead of the 2020 contest. The belief was it was in the Corbynistas' hands. It was theirs to lose because they had remade the Labour membership in their image. And that turned out not really to be particularly accurate at all. The Corbyn candidate, Rebecca Long-Bailey, she won the members who had joined during Corbyn's years in charge, but there were lots of grizzled veteran Labour members who'd stuck it out all the way through that period. They voted heavily for Starmer. A bunch of new people signed up. They voted heavily for Starmer. Now we potentially have the same process in reverse. It may be that the Labour membership hasn't lost as many left-wingers as people think because they're just biding their time waiting for a new opportunity. Or it might be the case that actually there's a sort of middle majority in the Labour membership, much as there is in the Labour parliamentary benches, who just want competent leadership that can deliver another election win and less bothered about the ideological aspects. As
a political scientist who's looked at these things for a long time, how dangerous do you think it is to try to change the leader? I mean, clearly he's unpopular, clearly the Labour Party is unpopular, but then there are lots of people, including the markets, the bond markets, watching this process. Is it a dangerous process?
Well, I mean, any change of leader is inevitably a process with risk, because the whole reason you're undertaking the process is to bring about change, and change is necessarily a volatile and risk-strewn process. But 2 points I would make on the other side of the argument is, number one, there are only two things that reliably impact on parties' fortunes in the polls in a big way. One is recessions and the other is leadership changes. And the second point to make, which is related to the first, is the current leader has the worst opinion poll ratings of any prime minister in history. Yeah. So it isn't a wonder that we're speculating about the possibility of changing, because the downside risks looks relatively small, the upside opportunities by historical standards relatively large, perhaps.
Very, very interesting. We all rely in life a bit on gut instinct as well as data. Your gut instinct, will he be prime minister by the time of the next general election?
My gut instinct, frankly, which is a polling-based gut instinct, as is appropriate for someone in my kind of work, is that he won't be, because I don't see how a prime minister with such poor ratings so early on, presiding over a parliamentary party where so many Labour MPs have really small majorities, which is the legacy of his general election victory last summer. I just don't see... I don't really see any way in which it gets turned around, and I don't really see any way in which he gets through that without a sufficient minority of Labour MPs saying, let's give somebody else a go. That's my gut instinct. I've been wrong before.
And that is not something, Professor Ford, we are going to have an argument about. But thank you very much indeed for joining me. In a few minutes' time, the latest in a slew of damaging stories about Reform's leader Nigel Farage, as he's now been accused of breaking electoral law for his seat in Clacton. Our political correspondent will be here with all the details. But the time now, 6:32, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
The chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has told LBC.
With Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:35. Let's go back to our top story tonight. European leaders gathered in Downing Street this afternoon. But the key question is, do they understand the gravity of Donald Trump's shift in his attitude to Europe? Saying that migration and censorship is leading to civilizational erasure on the continent, is Europe losing the backing of its biggest and most crucial ally? Well, let's hear now from Jim Townsend, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Defence for Europe and NATO under President Obama. How worried does he think we Europeans should be about this so-called erasure?
Well, I would be worried only if you saw the administration taking steps to try to implement this kind of policy. Or is the administration giving money to opposition parties? Is the administration actually leaning forward into meddling in European domestic politics? But, there's a lot of just rhetoric that comes out of this administration, as well as written bombast. And so I think we have to see just how far they're willing to go to implement something like this.
I'm sure you're right, but there is evidence, is there not, that certainly MAGA people, if not the administration, have been very close to some of the right-wing populist movements challenging traditional European governments. I'm thinking about Viktor Orban in Hungary and his people, for instance, but right across Europe.
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, if you remember, after Trump's first term, I think Steve Bannon and some of the MAGA people came over to Europe wanting to spread MAGA. Then they went to Italy and they went to Hungary. I know that. So this is something that they seem to be taken on as a bit of a crusade, if you will. And so finding that kind of language in that Europe paragraph, to me, had the fingerprints of J.D. Vance on it. And I was surprised to see it in there, frankly. But I think the authors of this document are not big strategists. And there's a lot of the philosophers of MAGA certainly had their fingers in this in terms of writing it up, and they have Europe in the crosshairs.
And you've had a long sort of overview of this relationship. How much of a turning point do you think it is for Europe? And do you think we're at a moment when we really have to think differently about our own political and military leadership?
Well, it's that's a very good question, and it's the question we're debating and discussing all through Washington right now, all the Europeanists and transatlanticists, and we're talking to our colleagues across the Atlantic about this. I think it would be a mistake to think this is a one-off. We thought of Trump 1 as a one-off, and Biden was elected, and then Trump 2 came roaring back in. So this isn't a one-off. There is some bipartisan energy behind this in terms of Europe doing more. I don't think there's any bipartisan support for the culture wars of this, if you will, the erasure bit. But I think in terms of thinking differently, in terms of the transatlantic alliance, and not being so dependent on the United States, taking up more of the conventional defense of Europe. The U.S. now can focus on China. But a lot of that was muddied by this national security strategy. So, But I think it is certainly a turning point.
So this is really a moment where European leaders have said again and again that they're going to increase defense and military spending, the Germans in particular, but Britain and France as well. But this is the moment when we really have to do it, mean it, and follow it through.
Well, that's absolutely right. And, it's not just defense spending, but it's filling gaps that the U.S. is going to leave. It's also the European defense industry being able to make this sustainable. It's also the Europeans being able to give Ukraine the weapons they need. So there is a hard job ahead for the allies, particularly because there were discussions in the Pentagon, according to news reports, where NATO officials were told by Pentagon officials that they have till about 2027 to get their ducks in a row, and that the U.S. was going to step back from the alliance in terms of defense planning. Defense planning is the heart and soul of what NATO does. It organizes NATO's defense. If the U.S. is going to step back from that, that's even more pressure on Europe given a very short timeline to try to fill gaps that might be left by the U.S.
You mentioned Ukraine just now, and of course President Zelenskyy is here in London. And in a sense, the German, French and British leaders are kind of putting an arm around him after Trump was again very, very bitterly critical of him for not having read the peace plan, he alleges. So this moment for Ukraine, clearly they're struggling on the battlefield. They're having a very, very hard time. It's a big morale problem, is it not, if President Trump indicates that he is about to walk away?
Well, it is, and we've heard that from the soldiers on the front lines. They've done interviews in the past, both with UK and US media, and we've heard them talk about that. But I think, in conjunction with the national security strategy, where the administration gave in to some of the Putin demands, not enlarging NATO, there's also a commentary about what we would call the future of the European security structure, and listening to Russian views and trying to have stability between the U.S., Europe, and Russia. There were a lot of things in there that was music to Putin's ears. Yeah. And it's going to make it harder for Zelenskyy to remain firm and stand if the U.S. and Russia are already marching ahead, certainly rhetorically, in lockstep. This is a crisis time right now for Zelenskyy. Over and above the past couple of months of crises, this is a real one.
And it's very hard to tell from the outside exactly what they're talking about, but it appears that the issue now is how much land and where to give up to Russia to let these talks go ahead. The danger, presumably, for Ukraine is that if it gives up too much, it's giving away its own defensive lines. And in other words, it's making it easier for Russia to go further later on if they want to.
Right, and that is tied right into the security guarantee, which is another area I think they're having trouble with too. So if in fact they do give up these defensive positions, as you point out, if that's going to be part of it, the other part has got to be a very strong Ukraine military, not a Ukraine military capped at a certain number. And there's got to be some robust guarantees that are actionable that come from the coalition, the willing, as well as from the United States. And I think it's the U.S. side of this that Zelenskyy wants to nail down. So what does this mean in terms of the U.S. role in security guarantees? Is it going to be Article 5 like? Is it going to be something where the U.S. is going to actually have prepositioned equipment in Ukraine, maybe, or its troops in Germany might have that as a mission? I mean, how secure is this U.S. role in the security guarantee?
Well, that's absolutely the crucial thing. I'm moving really from defense strategy to psychology at this point. But it's been strange that at this moment in the endless negotiations, Trump seems to be leaning back again towards Putin, because Putin has given him absolutely nothing and has stonewalled and stonewalled and stonewalled. And yet Trump seems to be leaning his way again.
Well, it's what, you're right. And it kind of makes you wonder if that's where he has been all along. Every now and then coming up with something that's pro-Ukraine, or remember the big meetings that they had in Washington after the Alaska summit. All the European the major European heads of state and government were there around the table, and things looked like Trump was leaning towards Zelenskyy and leaning towards a potential victory. Remember, he had even talked about that. But then, like you said, he goes back to Russia. This time is different because when you pair up what was said in the national security strategy that was against Europe, that was pro-Russian, and on top of that, there are two tweets that came from the Deputy Secretary of State, who was quite raw, talking about to the Europeans, you can't be both in NATO and the EU. It's one or the other. You can't wear both hats. Trying to make the case that the EU is anti-U.S. while in NATO they're pro-U.S. How can you have it both ways? And as well as these Pentagon talks that raise this idea of some type of final date 2 years from now, when the Europeans need to have everything wrapped up and ready for conventional defense of Europe. So you put those together, and I don't see Trump flipping back towards Zelenskyy anytime soon.
This feels like a very dangerous time for this part of the world coming. Not a particularly cheering conversation, but an absolutely essential one, Mr. Thompson. Thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
6:44. For Nigel Farage, it's the best of financial times and the worst of financial times. Shortly after Reform won a record-breaking £9 million donation, Mr Farage was reported to Essex Police for breaking electoral law by failing to declare all his spending in Clacton during the general election. The police will now be interviewing a whistleblower who worked on Mr Farage's campaign. I'm joined now by Aggie, LBC's political correspondent. Aggie, we should be clear at the beginning that in effect, spending more money than you're entitled to spend is a form of cheating.
Exactly. And it depends what constituency you're in terms of how much you can spend. But for Clacton-on-Sea, in the general election campaign last year, they were allowed to spend £20,660. But the allegation is from a man called Richard Everett. He is a former Reform councillor. He's a member of the campaign team. The allegation is that they went well beyond that, spending about £9,000 more than that. He says that the figure they said they spent did not include things like leaflets, banners, utility bills, a refurbishment for a Reform-themed bar in the campaign office, and also usage of an armoured Land Rover. So Richard Everett also has said that he thinks Nigel Farage was blissfully unaware of the fact that he thinks that they went over. But now Essex Police is looking into this. They're looking at the documentation he has handed over. For their part, Reform UK say that they're pretty relaxed about this. They say they're not worried. Their lawyers have looked at it. They say their party denies breaking electoral law. They look forward to clearing their name. And these are inaccurate claims, they say, from a disgruntled former councillor. And they talk about the fact that he was expelled several months ago.
If they're wrong about that and they're actually found guilty, what is the sort of penalty that they face?
So there can be prosecution. There could be personal prosecution for Nigel Farage and for his election agent, possibly up to a year of imprisonment or unlimited fines. Having said that, and also blocked from standing from office for a time as well. Having said that, there is usually a statute of limitations of 1 year, which Reform UK are pointing to. There are exceptions if the breach is seen to be big enough. But at the moment, Reform UK is basically saying nothing to see here.
Well, I would say a jolly interesting story nevertheless, Aggie. Thank you so much for that. Now, coming up.
So you don't know what the budget is, but you don't want to look like...
LBC Tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:49. Younger voters often feel forgotten and overlooked in British politics, with so much focus and so much money seemingly directed to the older generation. But that may be changing as the Prime Minister launched his new TikTok account today. Using TikTok as a political tool isn't new, and my next guest, the political TikToker Cody Dala, knows that very well. Here he is explaining the Chancellor's decision to freeze income tax thresholds in last month's budget.
Now, Rachie says this budget is mainly raising money from the top 10% of earners, but the only problem is she's kind of gamed the system to make many people accidentally part of that 10%. That's because she's frozen tax thresholds. Stay with me. The threshold that matters is the one that begins at £50,271. Any money you earn after this amount, ooh, look at you, is taxed at 40%. Freezing the threshold means anyone whose salary is currently below that, but whose salary rises with inflation, might accidentally end up in the 40%. Boom, you've been sneaky, sneaky, bang, banged.
You're very fast, very eloquent. If I was like that, my team would say, Andrew, slow down, you're going far too fast. But I'm an old guy. That was really interesting. I'm wondering whether you have seen Keir Starmer's TikTok account and what you feel about that. And you're roaring with laughter already. Go on.
I have seen Keir Starmer's TikTok account, and actually, I only found out about it because you told me about it. So it's gone under my radar. But yeah, I've seen the video, and I think it's probably good he's on TikTok, but I don't think it's a very good TikTok video. So
it's very, very sort of traditionalist. You know, as somebody who is on TikTok doing very, very well. What are the important aspects of political communication on TikTok? You can't simply stick a camera in somebody's face and ask them to say something.
No, exactly. But it's about using, which again, I think maybe came across in the clip you just played. It's basically about simplifying language and recognizing that TikTok is unlike any other form of communication. It's not like you can't put the same, information you'd put in an op-ed into a TikTok video. It's just a different arena. So I find the most effective way of communicating politics is using simple language that people will understand, and that's what people respond to. Because I think people are, in my experience, people are very interested in politics, but the traditional way of communicating it is very off-putting. And it's not just that, using complicated words makes it sound elitist. It's not just that. It's just that, in this kind of dopamine generation we have, where you can literally just swipe in a second, you need to make sure you engage with understanding. So if you don't grab somebody's attention within a couple of seconds, you've lost them. They've gone. So right at the beginning, be funny, be surprising, not offensive necessarily, but certainly surprise them. Exactly, yeah. And also it's about curating the content in a way that is designed for that platform. So the difference between Keir Starmer's TikTok video just now is that it looks like it's been muddled together with kind of B-roll from stuff they would have used maybe to send to the news. And even his opening line is, TikTok follow me, which doesn't actually make any sense. It's like that, if you don't say TikTok follow me, you just go follow me on TikTok. And the difference between that content and Farage's, Nigel Farage's, is that his is entirely curated for that platform. Yes, his stuff is very, very impressive. And also I think Robert Jenrick is doing it well. So there are politicians who are learning how to use this. But basically, to do it, they're all going to have to think entirely differently about how they communicate. Yeah. Yeah, they're going to need another form of communications advisor. Like this is the thing. It's like, fine, it's great Keir Starmer is on it because that is where young people are getting their information from. But it's just like anything. It's fine, you can release a video, but you need to know how to use it, and he needs to have people around him who know how to use it. Because just uploading a video is no good. There's actually 2 videos on his TikTok account. One is TikTok follow me, and then some footage of him turning the Christmas lights on, which is very nice. And then the next video is Zelenskyy walking into number 10. Now, the problem with those videos is that they don't communicate any information. There's no message there. So, Cody, it is Keir Starmer here. Could you tell me how to do it better, please? Give me some advice. TikTok follow me. Yeah, TikTok follow me. That's I think that's the problem. A TikTok video is a very, very effective way of communicating information, but you've got to put the information in there, Cody, that was great fun and very interesting for me. Thank you so much. Now, for many years, David Dimbleby was the man at the helm of royal broadcasting in Britain. His father, Richard Dimbleby, provided the words for the late Queen's coronation in 1953, and he, David, has done all sorts of royal pageantry for the BBC. His father was a passionate monarchist. He disliked the flummery, but for most of his time at Broadcasting House, went along with the monarchy as a general idea. Now, liberated by retirement, he has made a 3-part documentary, What's the Monarchy For?, which asks some very hard questions. And he joins me now. David, great to have you on the show. This is a political programme, so you won't be surprised if I start by asking you about the King's political influence, these famous or notorious black spider letters that he's supposed to send to ministers all the time. What did you discover about that?
That they were much more, in my view, much more powerful, and people took notice of them, and they took up a lot of ministerial time, including the Prime Minister's time, with suggestions and prodding this and prodding that. In other words, proactive on the political front. I thought it was extraordinary, some of the things, talking about things that affect the Ministry of Defence, talking about things that affect agriculture. I mean, just an endless stream of letters. 2,000 a year. 2,000. So very, very unlike his mother. In other words, the political impact of the monarchy has changed with the change of monarch. Well, that was Prince of Wales, of course, as king. He says he'll be different. But then again, I'm not quite so sure that the evidence shows that, because we have we had film of him going down to taking the Prime Minister down to Cornwall to look at his housing estate there, the village that he's built to his design. And the palace said, oh, no, he didn't take the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister asked to go. But whatever the setup, we could find no evidence ever of a Prime Minister and the monarch going on a journey for political reasons. It's the first time it's ever happened. So when they say he's no longer doing it, and he even grudgingly says it may be a bit difficult, I'm not so sure. Of course, I'm not sure it's malicious. It's just interesting. One would like to. Very, very difficult to be an opinionated person and then suddenly stop being an opiniated person when you become king. Well, you've become an opinionated person, having got the other way. The other way, yes. Speaking of opinionated, did you feel at all differently about the monarchy when you set out on this project? Well, I was curious. I mean, you said at the beginning that I've done all these commentaries, and I have, but those are separate. They're special state occasions. There's not a moment to probe into the nature of monarchy when you're doing Trooping the Colour or the state opening of Parliament. But then looking back, I thought, what actually is this? We've got a new king. What actually is this monarchy for? And is it fit for purpose? And the evidence is that there is some opposition now. I mean, in Wales and Scotland, by a tiny number, a majority actually would favour a republic. Well, that's quite when you add that into the union of Scotland, England, Wales, and the United Kingdom, that's quite a heft of people. And young people, as we know, are always a bit against monarchy. Of course they are. They're against the establishment. But again, that number is growing. So I thought, let's just have a look at what they actually, first of all, what they do. Secondly, most important, about their wealth, which is hidden away, squirreled away, and their ability to avoid laws that everybody else is affected by. Equal opportunity. Race Relations Act doesn't apply. You know, and so I got intrigued by that. And then the more I delved into it, the more fascinating and extraordinary it became.
But fascinating to one side. What shocked you most?
I think the scale of avoidance of tax and avoidance of law that applies to everybody else. The argument being, put it most simple, that the head of state can't break the law because when you go to court, it's in the name of the head of state. It's a kind of logical circle. So, in effect, the head of state could commit any offence and could never be prosecuted because he'd be prosecuting in his own name. So it doesn't make any sense, really.
It is probably too hot a topic for a leading politician to pick up, but would you like to see a Monarchy Reform Act, as it were, put through?
I think I think there are things that can be changed, and I think things have to change. In that old saw, to stay the same, everything has to change. And I think William is showing signs. He keeps talking about I'm going to make changes on my agenda, but we don't know how profound they'll be. I don't think tinkering will work. I think the issue of their wealth needs to be addressed, whether it really belongs to them or to the nation.
Should they pay tax, do you think?
Well, they pay income tax, but on a voluntary basis. And they don't publish their tax returns. I mean, actually, Charles did publish his tax returns when he was Duke Prince of Wales, but William, for some reason, has stopped doing it. So they pay some taxes, but they get away with not paying an awful lot of taxes that everybody else pays. And they don't pay death duties, so they get richer and richer. I mean, the king is the first billionaire we've had on the throne. Just think of that.
That's
a billionaire on the throne.
Listening to you, Dave.
In a country that's on its knees economically, you know.
Very quick question. Has it made you a Republican?
No.
Thank you very much indeed, David Dimbleby. What an interesting conversation. Thanks so much. If you have missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order you'd like them, pause and rewind live radio and listen to a range of podcasts. So download the all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.